Hi, everybody, and welcome to our interview with Dr. Michael Wagner, one of our keynote speakers for our upcoming Reclaiming Conference taking place this September. Dr. Wagner is an independent researcher, writer, and columnist for the Western Standard. He's earned his PhD in political science from the University of Alberta and is widely known for his commentary on the Alberta independence movement. He's the author of works such as Time to Leave and No Other Option. He and his wife have 11 children, and they have been home educating for about 30 years. Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
We are excited to get to know you a little bit better. For our listeners who may not know you super well, can you tell us just briefly a little bit about your background and kind of what got you interested in advocating for the sovereignty of Alberta?
Sure. Well, like my educational background is I have a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. My area of research in graduate school was education policy in Alberta. That kind of ties in with the fact my wife and I have been home educating our children for about 30 years or so. So I was very interested in education policy, especially as it pertained to parental rights and educational choice in Alberta. But more recently, most of my work recently has been on the Alberta independence movement, as you mentioned. Like I was actually, as a teenager, I got involved in the independence movement in the early 1980s. That was back when Pierre Trudeau was attacking Alberta with the National Energy Program. So that was my first exposure to the independence movement. And, the movement kind of petered out by the late 80s and early 90s because of the Reform Party. The Reform Party was so successful. And so like other people, I kind of lost interest in it. But as I was doing research for other topics, I noticed that there was a lot of material available about the independence movement. And I thought there should be a book about the history of the independence movement in Alberta. So to make a long story short, I ended up writing that book in 2009. Actually, at that time, Stephen Harper was prime minister. And so people in Alberta were quite comfortable with the federal government at that time. So I wrote that book. It's called Alberta Separatism Then and Now, but it did not do well at all. Because Stephen Harper was prime minister, people were not interested in Alberta separatism. So there was no interest in that book at that time. And so it took until Justin Trudeau became prime minister for any interest in that book to materialize. And it was because of that book that people started asking me to write more. And so that's why I've written two other books subsequently about the Alberta independence movement. In 2021, I came out with No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta, which is basically where I explain why I think Alberta should become independent. But I had people who would read that book and liked it, but they said, we need to try one more thing to fix Canada. And I found that kind of frustrating because Albertans for like 40 years or more had been trying to fix Canada. So I wrote one more book last year called Time to Leave, Canada Cannot Be Fixed, to show how many things have been tried and how hard people had worked to try and reform Canada, from the Western perspective and hadn't been able to. And so it's my argument basically that, we've tried so hard to fix Canada over the last few decades and we haven't been able to achieve anything. And so I think independence is our best option now. And so that's kind of been what I've been working on in the last few months or years, especially like since April this year with the federal election. I've had lots of invitations to speak, to talk about these topics. And so that's kind of what I've been doing for the last few years, last few months is speaking and writing on these kind of topics. So that's kind of where I've been with my times recently in terms of these kinds of issues.
That's awesome. So you touched on a couple different points that I would love to kind of go back and expound on if you're all right with that. The
Yes.
first being is you mentioned you kind of got interested in the political side of things all the way back in high school. And I was listening to another interview that you did where you mentioned that it was the energy crisis or lack of energy or just like the energy discussion in general that you had kind of latched onto as a young man and were super interested in that. So, can you expound a little bit upon why that interested you? And then also kind of talk about your thoughts on there seems to be a bit of a global push towards green energy. So, what is your reaction to that particular movement? Is it beneficial? And, you can talk about Alberta specifically or just Canada at large.
Yeah, well, I'll just start with that latter part first, like with the push towards, clean energy, as they call it. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's done voluntarily and in a free market manner, but the way it's been implemented in the last few years, and especially in Canada, it's a command economy approach. It's the government is pushing us into a particular way of doing things. For example, at this point, gasoline vehicles are supposed to be no longer sold in Canada by 2035, only electric vehicles. That's not something that people are doing voluntarily. That's being forced on them by the government. And if electric vehicles were that good, people would adopt them voluntarily. So I'm very much opposed to government imposed mandates because it's from the people who believe in that think that the government knows best and people are stupid and they need to be told what to do. I do not appreciate that approach at all. And so, like, I'm not an expert on climate change and how it's affecting the world, but what I do know is that petroleum products are going to be necessary for several decades into the future. And we're still selling, I think it's about 100 million barrels of oil a day are being sold and used, and it might even be higher than that. And that's, the forecast for the foreseeable future. We need oil. So policies like those kind imposed by Canada's Liberal government that try to suppress the production and distribution of oil are not helpful. They're very harmful because they reduce the energy industry in Alberta, which reduces jobs and prosperity. And it doesn't actually affect climate change because all that means is other countries will produce that oil instead of Alberta. And so it doesn't make a net effect in terms of benefiting the world and by reducing, greenhouse gases or anything like that. So until there's a very effective green energy source that people are willing to adopt voluntarily, I think the government needs to step back and allow the market to take its to fulfill its role, and allow fossil fuels to be developed. I mean, that's what's best for Alberta. Alberta, is one of the most environmentally friendly jurisdictions in the world for production of oil. And so when we reduce our production, oil production in other areas that are not environmentally friendly, increase, and that's harmful for the environment. So our government, the federal government, should allow Alberta to produce as much oil as possible as we can do here. I mean, it helps our people, it helps our economy. It actually helps the Canadian economy because money that comes into Alberta, that helps, the federal government gets higher taxes that way. And there's other benefits, to other Canadians through jobs and economic success and things like that. So I think the government should not be, suppressing the Alberta oil industry in order to fulfill some kind of climate change agenda. Now, to go a little bit earlier, in your question, you mentioned like the energy crisis. Well, the energy crisis started in the early 1970s. Like in 1973, essentially there was a war in the Middle East, which led to a huge increase in the price of oil. Now, Alberta had large amounts of oil since it was known since 1947 when there was a oil discovery at Leduc, Alberta. And Alberta was producing lots of oil since then, but which was a very good resource, of course, but the price of oil back in those days was like $3 a barrel or something like that. So, it was good, but it wasn't a huge amount. So when that war in the Middle East started in September or October of 1973, the price of oil went from about $3 a barrel to close to $12 a barrel in just a few weeks. And so there was a massive surge in the price of oil, and Alberta was going to cash in really big because oil is a provincial resource. But our prime minister at that time was Pierre Trudeau, and he did a couple of things to prevent Alberta from benefiting as much as it should have. For one, he made an artificial price for oil in Canada so that when Alberta sold its oil within Canada, the price was much lower than the world price, and so Alberta didn't get the revenue it should have received from that source. Also, Pierre Trudeau put an export tax on Alberta's oil, which was unprecedented in Canadian history, so that when Alberta exported oil to the United States, and it exported a lot of oil to the United States, the federal government would take a huge percentage of that revenue, which should have gone to the province. So Alberta was not benefiting the way it should have from its oil resources, and so our premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, he actually called that export tax on oil the biggest ripoff in Confederation's history. And he fought Trudeau during the 1970s, trying to get a fair deal for Alberta for its oil within Canada. But then, to make a long story short, Pierre Trudeau was reelected in an election in 1980 where he actually campaigned against Alberta, saying, elect me and I'll put Alberta in its place, essentially. I mean, that's my words, but that's essentially what he was doing. And then he brought in the National Energy Program in October of 1980, which hammered Alberta's economy. I mean, it devastated Alberta's economy. And I'm surprised, in the traveling I've done just in the last few weeks, I've met people whose own families were affected by the National Energy Program. In fact, I talked to a guy who said he remembers as a child his father weeping over their financial losses from that National Energy Program. And I've heard stories of suicides and because businesses went under, people lost their homes and their jobs by the thousands in Alberta. And it was very, very harmful for Alberta. So it was actually, I was a teenager at that time. And even though my family was not involved in the oil industry, so we weren't directly affected in terms of job loss or anything like that. But it's still, I was growing up in Calgary and I was going to high school in Calgary, and there were other people who were affected. And it just seemed to me like an attack on my community. So I'd actually been interested in international politics up until that time. I hadn't been interested in domestic politics, but that was like a direct attack on my community. And that's, I think, what sparked my interest in getting involved in that movement. So I joined my first political party when I was 16. And I helped out with a candidate in the 1982 provincial election here. And I wasn't even old enough to vote. I just felt very, very motivated and it was kind of, it was an important event in my life to get me thinking about politics in Alberta and Canada, and the relationship between Alberta and Canada. So it was kind of a formative event, I guess you could say, in my life, and I never lost that interest. And so like I say, for many years during the 1990s, especially, there wasn't much interest in that kind of a movement, but there is now, again, because of Justin Trudeau. I mean, the independence movement in Alberta all along has been fueled by federal governments that attack Alberta. If it wasn't for the federal governments attacking Alberta, we wouldn't have this kind of movement and this kind of sentiment. But under Justin Trudeau, especially in the last 10 years, and now, of course, with Mark Carney, we'll see what happens with Mark Carney. But the Liberal government so far, has been very negative towards Alberta's energy industry. And so right now, our independence movement is very strong and it's growing, and there might be a referendum coming up. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how these things kind of tie together, my own personal experience on the movement itself.
That's awesome. Wonderful. Thank you. So and I'm not as familiar with Canadian politics because I am from the United States. So if you don't mind explaining a little bit to me about why does the leftist movement in Canada seem to consistently target Alberta?
Well, much of it has to do with the oil industry. Like, it was like in the 1970s and 80s, there was a shortage of oil. Like, because of that war in the Middle East, actually, some of the Arab countries, well, the Western countries were supporting Israel for the most part in that war, and the Arab countries were the ones with the oil. So some of the Arab countries started cutting off their oil to the West as a way of, punishing the West for supporting Israel. And that's what caused the oil prices and the gasoline prices to rise so quickly, and so dramatically. And so during the 70s, everybody was trying to get oil, like the governments were trying to get oil. And I think Jimmy Carter in the United States might have put, limits on prices and things like that. I can't remember exactly in the United States, but in Canada, it was the Pierre Trudeau government, and their idea was to try and get as much of that revenue for the federal government, because it was Alberta's resource. Alberta should have got the money, but the federal government was taking large portions of that money that should have been for the province, but they could use that, because the leftists want a bigger government, and that's a big source of revenue for creating a bigger government. It also actually subsidized oil imports into Eastern Canada, like Ontario and Quebec were the main support bases for the Liberal government, and they could take money from Alberta's oil and they could subsidize oil imports from other countries into Eastern Canada, so that Eastern Canadians did not have to pay the world price for gasoline or for oil. So it strengthened Trudeau's support base in Eastern Canada so that he could get reelected and Liberals could be reelected. But it's also part of the leftist idea that the government should control the economy and should make the decisions, by giving more money to the federal government, and it could decide what the energy policy should be. That's what actually the National Energy Program that I mentioned earlier, that's very much kind of a socialistic program, that the government should be the one deciding the oil production and the exploration and what goes on and who gets what, rather than the market determining that. So it's because of the oil that the leftists have been attacking Alberta. Back in those days, they want the oil and the money for the government, and now with the climate change agenda, they want to shut us down because they see us as a big contributor to the greenhouse gases and so on. And so it's easy for voters in places like Toronto and Montreal to support a government that shuts down jobs in Alberta. Like, they don't want, the government's not proposing shutting down industries in Ontario and Quebec. It's proposing shutting down industries in Alberta. So it's easy for leftists to support a government like that, where their own jobs and their own industries are protected, and the people who pay the price are the people in Alberta, who have been voting for Conservatives. So those are kind of like two angles, at least, that explain why the left is eager to attack Alberta in this kind of context.
Interesting. So, and I'll kind of bring it full circle to, what We Unify is trying to accomplish, and the fact that we're having you here as a speaker. Ultimately, the goal of this year's conference is to act as a unifying voice, especially for Alberta, because we get to be there this year, which is so exciting. In your mind, what is a beacon of hope, I guess, for Alberta? How should Albertan citizens move forward to establish sovereignty, to kind of like protect their citizens in an ideal world, or in your, mind? What should the vision be, and how should the people move forward?
Well, in terms of hopeful outcomes, right now or just recently, Premier Danielle Smith has made it easier for a citizens' initiative to get a referendum going. And so there is an organization here in Alberta, the Alberta Prosperity Project, that has submitted an application so that there could be a citizens' initiative to launch a referendum on independence in Alberta. So I think personally that that's the way forward for Alberta. I think we need that referendum on independence. And if we were to win that referendum, that would give Alberta a very strong hand, either to move towards independence, as you know what the vote would be, or at least what the constitutional law is that the federal government would be required to negotiate with Alberta over its independence if there was a successful independence referendum. And in the course of those negotiations, the federal government could offer to reform the country and change the country to make it more amenable to Alberta. So like my first choice would be for Alberta to become independent through an independence referendum. But I mean, we would want to be open to the possibility of the federal government wanting to, change the country and make it a better country so that maybe Alberta would be able to stay within it. Like that would be, like I say, that wouldn't be my first choice, but for many Albertans that would be, because like I think even though there's big support for independence in Alberta, many of those people who support independence are like me, they're frustrated because we've tried so much and it hasn't worked.
Yeah,
But
I was
many of
just about
them,
to say, hasn't that been the kind of the
yeah,
common theme? Like
that's
a little
right.
rat wheel, the same thing over and over. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. But most people, I think most Albertans, if they were given a reasonable option that wasn't independence, I think most of them would probably opt for that instead of independence. Like me personally, I
Mhm.
wouldn't, and I know there's many Albertans who we really want independence, but there
Mhm.
are a lot of people who would be willing to stay within Canada if there could be changes made so that Alberta would not be attacked like we have been over so many times over the last few decades.
Mhm. And what are some outside of the oil industry? I know you're a big advocate for like homeschool education. Has Alberta gotten the brunt of education restrictions as well?
Well, actually, Alberta has done pretty well in terms of education. Like
Okay.
in Canada, education is an exclusively provincial jurisdiction. So the
Mhm.
federal government has no authority in education, like K to 12 education, in any of the provinces.
Oh,
So Alberta
interesting.
has actually, I've actually written on this that Alberta was kind of the ground zero for educational choice in Canada. Like up until the 1970s, we kind of reflect what happened in the United States just a few years behind. But by the 1970s, there were many parents who had children in public schools who were becoming concerned about public schools. Because until the 1960s, the public schools basically represented the broad consensus of kind of a sort of a generally Christian kind of perspective, on things in terms of like marriage and, relationships and stuff like that. Now, things started changing in the 1960s, so that by the 1970s, there was new literature being brought in that didn't reflect traditional family values, for the children. And also there's new sex education programs brought in. And so parents with conservative mindsets, became concerned about public schools and started to create private schools in the 1970s here in Alberta. So there was a movement
Mhm.
towards private education, and that led to, there was a lot of resistance to that from the educational establishment and government officials. So it led to some court cases and government reports and changes in legislation, and much of that happened in Alberta. Alberta was like the cutting edge of that in Canada for these changes towards parental rights. And so throughout the 1980s, there was all kinds of controversies over private education and parental rights. And this is also when the home education movement started. Like first there was a wave of private schools, and then on the tail of that, there's home education came in, because home education is, I call it like a poor man's private school. Like if you want to have a private school, there's very much, there's more money involved and things like that, where you can avoid some of those issues if you home educate your own children. And anyway, so by the 1980s, we had the private school movement going and the home education movement going. And so there was, like I say, there was a lot of conflict over this because there was resistance from the teachers unions and other left-wing organizations that didn't want educational choice for parents. But in 1988, Alberta adopted a new Education Act, which actually included home education for the very first time in legislation in Alberta. And it also made things easier for some of the private schools. So educational choice in Alberta has been developing in a positive direction for the most part since the late 1970s. And so now
Mhm.
we even have charter schools for people who want, different forms of education that way. So we have charter schools and private schools, home education, and different variations within each of those. And so for the most part, I mean, there's been exceptions, there's been setbacks and things, but for the most part, Alberta has been a very friendly jurisdiction to educational choice and parental rights, and especially under the United Conservative Party, that government has been very favorable to parental choice and parental rights too. So Alberta's done very well that way, politically speaking, compared to other jurisdictions. Like I say, there's always setbacks and countermeasures from different groups and things like that. But overall, Alberta has done very well compared to other provinces in Canada.
Do you think that could potentially be under threat with the way that Canadian politics are currently trending?
Well, I think it would be very much under threat if the New Democratic Party won the next provincial election. I mean, we
Okay.
know the NDP does not support parental choice. I mean, when they were in government, they took some measures, like it took them they didn't expect to win in 2015, and it took them a couple years to get their wheels under them, so to speak. And by 2018 actually, they were threatening to shut down some of the private Christian schools because they wanted to force their ideology on some of the private schools, and some of the private schools were resisting that. And so they said, well, if you don't adopt these ideological measures, we're going to take away your funding and your accreditation. And so if it wasn't for the victory of the UCP in 2019, we would have lost several private Christian schools because they were not willing to conform to the NDP ideology. And so if the NDP is elected again, we're very, very likely to experience something along that lines, and perhaps even worse, because the NDP was very inexperienced when they first came into power, and like I said, it took them a little while to get some experience. Now they've got experience and knowledge about how the system works. So if they were to win the next provincial election, parental choice in education would very much be under threat. I think so. Yeah.
So, what are some actions that parents and educators can proactively take to prevent that from happening?
Well, I think for one thing, parents need to really be aware of what's happening politically in Alberta. Like they need to be on top of what's happening. And there are some group like Parents for Choice in Education, and there's another one. Can't remember the name right offhand, but a friend of mine. But there's parental choice groups in Alberta, and people can get involved in them. Get on their email lists, like to follow the issues and to know what's happening. And if they want to, if they have the time, like a lot of parents involved in private school and home education, like they're really busy with their families, and so they have to be careful about how much time they put into politics, because I think it's very, very important for parents of young children to put their children first, if you know what I mean. Like, do you put your family first? I know there's major issues that are happening that parents should be aware of and participate in, but always put your family first, even if that means, you can't do as much politically for a period of time until they're bigger. But generally speaking, the parents should be aware of what's going on. And if there are political, if there's legislation being proposed that's unfavorable to parental choice, they should be involved in contacting their politicians and other advocates to oppose that. And depending on their level of comfort and their expertise and their time commitment, they can get involved politically in certain groups and things like that. But it's very important, especially for them, to be aware of what's happening and to be willing to react and contact their politicians if something starts to move in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. So, kind of on that topic, I'm curious, how did you and your wife balance the home education of 11 children with your career as an author, a speaker, pursuing your PhD? I would love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, the truth is, like, my wife did the bulk of the work. There's just no question about that. But one of the things, when you think, there's so many children, like, how could you handle that? What realistically happens, I think, in so many home educating families,
Mhm.
is that the older children help with the younger children.
Yeah.
It couldn't have worked otherwise. Like the older ones, they've already got a certain level of education and they got a certain level of maturity. So while my wife would be working with one of the smaller children, the other smaller children could be supervised or helped in their home education by the older children, and it actually helps
Mhm.
the older children to learn too. When they're helping these
Yeah.
younger ones. So, but I would be involved to a certain degree, but realistically, my wife had the bulk of the work, and so she deserves the credit for much of what happened in that. There's just no way up around
Yeah.
that.
That's awesome. That's so good. And is she interested in politics, or does she just kind of go along with whatever you're up to?
Well, what's funny, because she had no interest in politics at all until
Mhm.
the trucker convoy of 2022. Like,
Yes.
I would talk to her. I would talk to her about political stuff, and she just, she would listen or
Yeah.
whatever, but she really had no passion for it or anything. There was something about that trucker convoy where she
Mhm.
was watching that on social media every day, and something clicked. And from that point forward, she has been interested in politics, and so, like, now I maybe appreciates more what I do, and she always comes with me, like, on all my speaking trips. She comes with me on all my
Oh,
speaking
that's
trips, and
awesome.
we have a lot of fun together. It's great that way.
That is so wonderful. I love that. Yeah, that particular incident seems to be a catalyst for a lot of people that I talk to. They're like, I wasn't super interested in politics until that time period between 2021, specifically that particular convoy. And they're like, oh, suddenly I want to get involved. I don't know why that is. It's so
Yeah.
fascinating to me.
Yes, it is.
Let's see. Okay, circling back to Albertan independence, you have been kind of talking about how this has been a very slow burn for a very long time and we're kind of finally starting to pick up traction. So, moving forward into the We Unify conference and just education, right? You talk a lot about it's important for people to be aware of what's happening in government. What are some tangible action items that our listeners could maybe resources they could utilize, podcasts that you recommend? I mean, your books obviously are an amazing resource, but for somebody who may not have any background in anything political, what's a good space for them to start?
Well, actually, the websites of uh, parental rights groups are a very good place to start. Like I mentioned, Parents for Choice in Education. I'm still trying to remember that the other organization. There's another organization
That's
also
okay.
that has a website with stuff, and the Alberta Home Education Association for those who are interested in home education. Also, there's an important group. There's a branch in Canada and the United States called the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Mhm.
And depending on which country you're in, that's one of the best resources for finding out about the political issues and the political threats to home education, depending on which province you're in. So that's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Mhm.
Um, and if for people who are just starting out, probably going to these websites and seeing what's available there would probably be a good place to start, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
And actually, the Alberta Home Education Association holds a convention every May in Red Deer, and I think it's
Okay.
the biggest home education convention in Canada every year,
Mhm.
and they have speakers on various topics, mostly from education, but other legal and political issues for parental choice. So that's something I would recommend.
Mhm.
Um, I think the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, at least in the United States, they do have regular podcasts, about,
Mhm.
it's mostly relevant to the United States, but there's a lot of stuff about home education that would be relevant for anybody in any country, about different ways of, different approaches and different, the philosophy behind it and the philosophy behind parental rights and things like that. So even Canadians could benefit by, the podcasts on some of the podcasts, at least on the website of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in the United States.
Mhm.
So those are some of the first things that come to mind, I guess, going to the organizations. And if they wanted more detail, like if people looked at the websites and they wanted more detail on a particular topic, they could probably contact the organizers and get feedback. Like I've got like lots of different books in my library on these topics. They don't come to mind immediately, but there's
Yeah.
different books that would be very helpful. Like, yeah. So I actually have written for the Alberta Home Education Association. I wrote a history of that organization and its fight for parental rights a few years ago, and they have that available. So
Okay.
if someone wanted to know about that, they could get that from that organization. Of course, I recommend that because I wrote it, but but
Yeah.
I do think
Yeah.
the information is very valuable. I think if someone wanted to know about the struggles, because right
Mhm.
now, like I run into young parents who are home educating, and they don't know about the struggles of the people who started the movement. Like in the 1980s,
Mhm.
there are people who risked going to jail, to home educate their kids because it wasn't legal to start with. And there's
Mhm.
a news story from 1983 of a family that was refused permission to home educate in Alberta, so they moved to Montana just to have the freedom to home educate. Because
Mhm.
back before 1988, I mentioned in the 1988 School Act. That mentioned home education for the first time. So
Mhm.
before that, it was up to the local school superintendent if a family could home educate or not. And some superintendents were very left wing and wouldn't allow parents to home educate. So the parents would have to move if they wanted to home educate. And that particular family that I mentioned moved to Montana. So in those early years, we didn't have the freedoms that we have today. And
Mhm.
it would be important, for younger families who haven't encountered these kind of difficulties, to know
Mhm.
what the pioneers of the movement, what they had to go through, and what they had to sacrifice, in order to win these rights for us, the rights for freedom that we have right now. So, I guess I got off on a bit of a rabbit trail there, but this is something
No,
that
it's
people should
great.
understand.
Yeah,
you know,
it's absolutely important, and it's interesting that the rise for Albertan independence and the rise for the ability to home educate kind of happened at the same time. That's very interesting to me. Do you think one had a lot to do with the other, or is it just coincidental that those two movements kind of sparked within the same time period?
I think it's actually coincidental because
Really?
they were sparked by entirely different events. Like the war in
Okay.
the Middle East. I mean, nobody could have predicted that. It led to energy policy changes, federal
Mhm.
government versus province. Whereas the other one was a larger general cultural trend that would have happened regardless of the what happened in the energy policy. And like
Mhm.
the cultural change that led to the private schools and homeschooling, that was happening in the United States and Canada at the same time. It was kind of just a broader cultural change in English speaking world, away from traditional values and towards, like in the public school system, away from traditional values and towards more modern values, which created concern among many parents. They didn't want their children, getting that new ideology. They wanted them to be raised in traditional morality. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so that's why the private schools were created. That's why many people got into homeschooling, at least in the early years. They wanted their children to receive a traditional education and not the new modern ideologies that they were getting in the public education system. So yeah, these were two different trends. Like you say, they
Mhm.
were happening about the same time, but I,
Yeah.
I don't think there's a relationship between them.
Do you think there's a relationship between them now?
Boy, I've never thought of that before. I don't think there's a direct relationship between them, but what I would say is there would be crossover. Like a lot of the people involved in the independence movement are conservative-minded people, like traditional-minded people, and those are the same kind of people that are the support base for parental rights in private schooling and home education. So,
Okay.
like, I wouldn't say they're direct related, but if you go, like, let's say if you were to go to, if you go to a home education convention in Red Deer,
Mhm.
and then you go to say an independence movement meeting in Red Deer,
Mhm.
there'd probably be some of the similar faces you'd see. But again,
Interesting.
it's not a
Yes, that
direct
makes sense.
relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That definitely makes sense. Oh, cool. Well, that pretty much covers the list of the questions that I had. Is there anything specific that you would like to touch on or that you want our audience to know going into prepping for this upcoming conference? Any little hooks that you might want to share? No pressure.
Well, actually, I don't know if it'd be appropriate for me to mention where some of my books would be available.
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely. Please do.
okay? There's a homeschooling supply business based in Didsbury, a small town here in Alberta. They
Mhm.
sell like I mentioned, home education materials, but they're friends of mine, so they also sell my books. Their store is called Merchant Ship, and so if you go to the website, just in lowercase merchantship.ca, and if you were to go there and search my name, my last name Wagner, my books would be available there. You could just see. I mean, even if you're not interested in buying them, you can just see what I've written, and most of my books, three of them are on Alberta independence, but
Mhm.
a couple of books are about Christianity and politics in Canada because that's my other area of interest. The influence of Christianity and politics in Canada. So
Mhm.
the books that I've written are basically mostly on those two themes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think that draws our discussion to a conclusion. Thank you so much for your time. For our listeners, if you want to hear more from Dr. Wagner, we encourage you to visit the weunify.ca website, where you can find out more about our Reclaiming Conference and have access to the conference taking place in Calgary, Alberta, September 19th through 21st. We encourage you to grab those tickets while they are still on sale, and we hope to see you there.